The parable we just heard from Luke's Gospel has been acknowledged as by far the most difficult parable to understand. I love reading books by Paula Gooder, who's a theologian, a very capable theologian, but also she writes extremely well, not using pretentious terms, really trying to write in a way that us lay people can understand. She's absolutely excellent. And I'm reading a book where she goes through all of the parables of Jesus. And even she says, this has to be the trickiest and hardest of all parables to understand. So hard, in fact, that there is almost no agreement at all about what it means or how we should interpret it. So good luck to the preacher. Most parables are quite easy to follow. There's only two things to understand: the story itself and then the underlying meaning. The parable of the sower is quite easy. We can all understand the concept of sowing seed by throwing it around. And it's quite easy to understand the meaning because Jesus is one of the few parables that Jesus actually explains in great detail. And we can understand that the seed going on to stony ground or whatever, representing people who hear the word but don't respond to it. But with our parable today, we have a lot of difficulty with both elements, the story itself and then with the meaning behind it. There are certainly some very good teachings that we can get from the passage, which I'll be going on to. However, it isn't really obvious how we get from the story to the teaching. But we'll do our best. The story itself, as I said, needs a bit of guesswork to what's going on. We have a wealthy man, referred to as the master, owns a lot of land, including olive groves and wheat fields. And the probability is that what's happening, he rents these things out to tenant farmers. So they do all the work in producing the olive oil and getting the wheat. But as by way of rent for using the master's property, they pay him in kind. So they will give him a portion of the olive oil or a portion of the wheat. The master employs a manager, which is sometimes called a steward or a manager, to oversee all this. But we're told that the manager has not performed the job well. He's squandered his master's money, and he's done a very poor job, and his master is actually going to dispense with his services. But just before he is fired from his job, he does something a bit odd. He goes to each of the tenant farmers and asks them to pay their rental in the form of goods. But instead of asking for the full amount owed, he gives them this massive discount. So if the olive grove farmer who owed 800 gallons of oil to the master for their payment of rent, the manager says, well, tell you what, just give me 400 and that's okay. Well, nobody really knows why he did that or what it means. Was he just being dishonest and cheating his master? Or maybe he'd made such a mess of things that the tenant farmers didn't feel obliged to pay anything, so getting 400 was better than nothing. There's even been suggestions that the steward didn't actually work for a salary, but the steward could add something to the amount as his commission. So maybe that missing 400 was actually the commission he would have got, but he's actually now being a bit more honest than we thought, and he's foregoing his commission in order to get at least something for his master. It's all a lot of guesswork. But one thing that we do know, he does say what his motive for this is. He says, if I give them a discount, they're going to thank me for that. And when I've lost my job, they perhaps will give me a job, although that seems doubtful. He's going to get a good reference from his master, but at least they might feed me or shelter me. Well, all a bit mysterious. So let's move on to firmer ground and look at what Jesus is teaching us. First thing is to look at context, the passages surrounding this. At the end of the passage, we have the well-known verse, no slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Sometimes it says God and money, or God and mammon. Immediately after the passage, we see the reactions of the Pharisees who'd been listening. And it said the Pharisees who loved money heard all of this and were sneering at Jesus. And then straight after, we have the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Remember the rich man who had everything he needed. Lazarus was a poor man begging at his table but got given nothing. And then when the rich man went to hell and Lazarus went to heaven, the rich man cried out to Lazarus to help him, but was told it was too late. So, taking all that into consideration, the whole theme of these chapters is about wealth and how we use it. But I think it's a lot more useful to widen the term wealth, to go beyond just pure money or goods, but include everything that we have that we might call wealth. And that could be our time and talents and abilities. So money and goods, time, talents, all things that as Christians we believe are gifts from God and to be used in his service. Now, in verse 8, Jesus makes a key distinction between who he calls the children of this age and the children of light. In Ephesians, Paul writes, "For once you were in darkness, but now in the Lord you are light. Live as children of light." So, Jesus, in this parable, in his explanation, he distinguishes between those who follow him and live by God's rules, who he calls children of light, and from those who instead ignore God's rules and they live by the world's values, and he calls them children of this age. So Jesus' teaching is how will his followers, the children of light, handle wealth in all its forms, money, time, talents, as distinct from those who don't follow him, children of this age. So in trying to distill the lessons from this, I read a lot of commentaries and stuff, and lots of useful stuff, but again, all a bit confusing because it's such a complex passage. But I've tried to distill 3 fairly clear points that we get from this. First of all, be trustworthy and faithful with the gifts that God has given us. Second, be shrewd in how we use our gifts. And thirdly, whatever we do, take decisive action. So, the first, being trustworthy and faithful with our gifts. Clearly, the manager in our parable was not trustworthy. He hadn't managed his master's affairs at all well, and when he was in trouble over it, he embarked on this crazy scheme without consulting his master. We need to be trustworthy with the gifts that God has given us. First, we need to recognize and give thanks for all the good things we've been given, whether that be wealth, health, time, talents. Then we need to make sure we use them faithfully in God's service, and in so doing, merely giving back to God what he has given to us. But Jesus goes on to make a further point. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with worldly wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? So what Jesus is saying is that although use of worldly wealth and the way we use our money is very important in its own right, it's even more important because it's an indication of how we will look after far greater riches, that is, the riches of God's promises in God's word. So yes, we've been entrusted with money, time and talents to be used faithfully and wisely, but even more, we have been entrusted with the riches of God's kingdom to be grasped and to be shared. The second point, be shrewd in how we use our gifts. Shrewd means having sharp powers of judgment, being astute. In a sense, it's similar to the point I just made, but there's an extra emphasis here. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. As Christians, we tend to be wary of language like that. You know, being astute, being shrewd in our business and our financial dealings sounds as if it's just bordering on the edge of getting into slightly underhand, sharp practice or even into dishonesty. But does that mean Christians should be naive and gullible in their handling of worldly affairs? Well, I think we all have come across, maybe we've done it ourselves, come across people as, because they are Christians, they're a bit of a soft touch. So we're a bit of a soft touch for sob stories, people coming up to the street, or begging letters and so forth. As Christians, we feel we should respond with compassion and generosity. And I suppose that goes with the territory. Everybody at some point is going to be the victim of something like that. But we shouldn't think that is a good thing. Christians should not be naive and gullible. We need to be astute. We need to be savvy in worldly things. We need to use our intelligence and our experience to try and sort out what is our genuine use of our resources and what isn't. So in this parable, Jesus says the manager used his astuteness and savviness to get what he wanted, just like people of this age. But he says the children of light, his followers, they must also use their experience and knowledge to manage our resources. But he makes the point that our motives in doing so are very different. Our motive for being savvy with the world's wealth will be to further God's kingdom. We'll be there not to prioritize our personal situation, but out of concern for others. In the final verse, Jesus tells us we cannot serve both God and money. But in serving God, it doesn't mean we have to ignore money or be wasteful with it. And finally, take decisive action. There's a point in this parable about action. This steward, though managed badly and was a bit dishonest, at least he took shrewd and decisive action, tried to do something to remedy his situation. When Jesus started his ministry, he emphasized that people do need to take decisive action. They need to decide to follow him. They can't keep putting off the decision. So once again, we have this comparison between the children of this age and the children of light. So just as the steward took decisive and shrewd action to remedy his situation, how much more should we, the children of light, be decisive, make our decision to follow Jesus, and in all that follows from that, to secure our heavenly future. Amen.